"Don't hurt me. I'll do anything," she begged, but the giant Apache just pointed to his horse. Out here, a girl with no name, no family, and no hope thinks she's at the mercy of the biggest man she's ever seen. Dust on her face, blood on her feet. She's ready to crawl if it means survival. But that Apache ain't here to take. He's here to give her a choice. A stolen spring, a sister behind iron bars, and a deed that could break the whole town's grip on the land. The townsfolk think they know who owns this valley. But what if a crumpled paper, hidden in a church, guarded by a priest, holds the truth no one wants to hear? When a girl with nothing teams up with a man who's lost everything, they'll have to face a question that could burn the town to the ground. Every story begins with a heartbeat. Tell me, where are you in the world today? And how are you really doing? Your words make this space feel more human. The Arizona sun hung low on the horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and purple. Mira Callahan stumbled forward, her bare feet raw and bleeding from the rough terrain. Each step sent jolts of pain through her legs, but she forced herself to keep moving. Her throat felt like sandpaper, and her cracked lips stung with every ragged breath. The sound of running water caught her attention, and hope flickered in her chest like a fragile flame. Through bleary eyes, she spotted a shallow creek ahead. But her relief quickly turned to terror when she noticed the massive figure standing beside it. A tall Apache man stood next to a powerful warhorse, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the darkening sky. His hands moved with practiced ease as he tended to his mount, checking its hooves and adjusting the worn leather saddle. Mira's legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed to her knees in the dust, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. Without thinking, she reached out and grabbed the hem of his long coat, the rough fabric cool against her fingers. "Don't hurt me," she pleaded, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'll do anything." The words tasted bitter in her parched mouth, but desperation drove them out. The Apache warrior, Nantan, though she didn't yet know his name, looked down at her with dark eyes that revealed nothing of his thoughts. His face remained still as stone, neither threatening nor welcoming. For a long moment he simply studied her, and Mira's heart thundered in her chest. Then, without a word, he pointed to his horse. Mira stared at him in confusion, her mind struggling to make sense of this silent command. Was he taking her prisoner? Would he sell her to someone else? But she had no strength left to resist. On shaking legs, she pushed herself up and stumbled toward the massive animal. Nantan's movements were efficient but careful as he helped her onto the horse. His hands were strong but didn't grip too tight, showing neither cruelty nor particular kindness. Once she was settled, he swung up behind her with fluid grace. The horse's steady gait rocked them gently as they began moving through the gathering dusk. Mira sat rigid with tension, waiting for some sign of what fate awaited her. But Nantan made no threatening moves. Instead, he reached around her to uncork a water skin and offered it to her. The sight of water made Mira's throat constrict with need. She grabbed the skin with trembling hands and took several desperate swallows before forcing herself to stop. The water was warm but clean, and it felt like life itself flowing down her throat. After she had drunk, Nantan produced a strip of dried meat from a leather pouch. The jerky was tough and salty, but to Mira's empty stomach it was the finest feast imaginable. She chewed slowly, savoring each bite as strength gradually returned to her limbs. They rode in silence as the sky deepened to indigo. Nantan seemed content without conversation, and Mira slowly began to realize that, whatever his intentions might be, immediate harm wasn't among them. Her rigid posture gradually relaxed, though she remained alert to any change in his demeanor. The rhythmic sound of the horse's hooves and the gentle evening breeze began to lull her tired mind. As her immediate terror faded, questions began to surface. Why would an Apache warrior help a white girl? Where were they going? What would happen when they got there? Through the growing darkness, she could make out the silhouette of buildings ahead, San Gabriel, though she didn't recognize it yet. The sight brought mixed emotions. Relief at finding civilization, but also uncertainty about what awaited her there. Mira snuck glances at her silent companion when she thought he wouldn't notice. His face remained impassive, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of dignity rather than menace. His careful handling of his horse showed patience and respect for the animal. These small details began to chip away at her initial terror. The cool night air carried the scent of sage and desert flowers. Coyotes called in the distance, their yips and howls echoing across the empty landscape. Under different circumstances, Mira might have found it frightening, but somehow Nantan's solid presence behind her made the wild sounds seem less threatening. As they rode, Mira's fear gradually gave way to a tentative curiosity about this mysterious man who had chosen to help her when he could have simply left her to die in the desert. She didn't understand his reasons, but she was beginning to suspect that her initial assumptions about him, shaped by years of frontier prejudices and fearful stories, might have been wrong. The horse's steady pace carried them closer to the town, and with each step, Mira felt herself moving further from the desperate girl who had collapsed at a stranger's feet, and closer to something unknown but somehow hopeful. Morning sunlight filtered through the cottonwoods along the creek, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Mira sat on a smooth rock, watching Nantan work with quiet efficiency. Her body ached from yesterday's desperate journey, but the night's rest had restored some of her strength. Nantan moved with practiced ease around their small camp, stirring a pot of beans that hung over the modest fire. The aroma made Mira's stomach growl, reminding her how long it had been since she'd eaten a proper meal. She wrapped her arms around herself, still unsure of her place in this strange situation. The big Apache reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a tin cup, filling it with beans before passing it to her. His movements were deliberate, careful not to startle her. Mira accepted the cup with trembling hands, savoring the warmth that seeped through the metal. "Much obliged," she murmured, the words barely above a whisper. Nantan nodded, then settled himself on a fallen log across from her. He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his English came slow and measured. "Need help," he said, gesturing toward the horizon where San Gabriel lay. "My sister." Mira looked up from her beans, curiosity overcoming her caution. "Your sister?" Nantan's face tightened with concern. "Sani, they keep her in jail." His hands moved as he spoke, adding meaning where words failed him. "They say she steals spring water." He reached into his coat and withdrew a weathered piece of paper, carefully unfolding it. Mira could see elaborate script and a red seal, though the words were in Spanish. Nantan pointed to the document, then to himself and made a flowing motion with his hand. "Water rights, Spanish deed, our family land." Understanding began to dawn in Mira's mind. "They took your water?" The words caught in her throat, memories of her own family's loss rising like bile. Nantan nodded gravely. "Cannot go to town." He gestured to himself, then made a shooting motion. "They see Apache man, they shoot." Mira's spoon halted halfway to her mouth. She could see where this was leading. "You want me to go into town?" "You go. Find Sani." Nantan's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw a flicker of emotion there, worry for his sister. "White girl, they not shoot." Mira set her cup down, her appetite suddenly gone. Fear warred with another emotion, understanding. She knew all too well how the powerful could twist the law to steal what wasn't theirs. The memory of flames consuming her family's barn flashed through her mind, along with her father's final words about standing up to land grabbers. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, though the heat had gone out of her suspicion. Nantan gestured to the creek, the food, then to her. "I help you. Now you help Sani?" It was a question, not a demand. Mira looked down at her bare feet, then at the beans in her cup, the first real food she'd had in days. She had nothing, no one left in the world. This strange alliance might be her only chance at survival, and maybe even justice. "I'll help," she said quietly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Relief showed briefly in Nantan's expression before he nodded and began breaking camp. The morning passed slowly as they traveled, their pace deliberately gentle to accommodate Mira's exhaustion. The desert stretched endlessly around them, broken only by scattered rocks and hardy brush. Nantan led his horse, allowing Mira to ride. The sun climbed higher, baking the earth beneath them. He shared his water skin whenever she needed it, though she tried not to drink too much, aware of its precious nature in this harsh land. By mid-afternoon, the adobe walls of San Gabriel appeared on the horizon, rising from the desert like a mirage. The sight made Mira's heart beat faster. Somewhere within those walls, an innocent woman named Sani sat in a jail cell, accused of stealing what was rightfully hers. The town grew larger as they approached, its sun-baked walls taking on more detail. Nantan stopped while they were still well outside the town's view. He helped Mira down from the horse, then pointed to a cluster of rocks where he would wait. "Find Sani," he said simply. "Tell her, brother comes." Mira nodded, squaring her shoulders despite her fear. She understood now that she wasn't just accepting help. She was becoming part of something larger. The same greed that had destroyed her family was at work here, and for the first time since losing everything, she had a purpose. She took a step towards San Gabriel, then paused to look back at Nantan. He stood beside his horse, a silent guardian who had saved her life, and now trusted her with his sister's fate. The weight of that trust settled over her like a blanket, both heavy and somehow comforting. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as Nantan reined his horse to a stop near a stand of cottonwoods. The adobe buildings of San Gabriel shimmered in the distance like a mirage, their walls bleached white by years of harsh sunlight. Mira slid from the saddle, her legs trembling from the long ride. Nantan reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a piece of paper, worn soft at the creases. With careful movements, he smoothed it against his leg and handed it to Mira. She studied the crude map he had drawn, showing the town's main street and the squat building marked as the jail. "Here," he said quietly, shrugging off his poncho. The worn garment was far too large for Mira's small frame, but it would hide her tattered dress. "Keep head down, listen much, speak little." Mira pulled the poncho over her head, breathing in the leather and smoke scent that clung to the fabric. "Where will you be?" Nantan gestured to the cottonwoods. "Watch. Wait." His dark eyes held hers. "Be careful." The weight of his trust pressed down on Mira's shoulders as she started toward town. Each step kicked up little puffs of dust around her bare feet. She kept her head lowered, just as Nantan had instructed, but her eyes darted constantly, taking in every detail. The town's streets were mostly empty in the afternoon heat, but Mira felt the weight of watching eyes from behind curtained windows. A pair of women on a porch stopped their conversation as she passed, their whispers carrying on the still air. "Another one of them Indian lovers. Probably works for that washerwoman down by the creek." Mira hunched deeper into the poncho, letting their assumptions shield her. The jail wasn't hard to find, a square adobe building with barred windows and a heavy wooden door. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached. The deputy sat in a chair outside, his boots propped up on a barrel. His eyes narrowed as Mira approached. "What's your business here?" Mira forced her voice to remain steady. "Brought food for the Indian woman." She held up the small bundle Nantan had given her. "From Senora Rosa's washing house. She says the prisoner needs to keep up her strength to work when she gets out." The deputy's face creased with suspicion, but he stood and unlocked the door. 5 minutes. No more. The jail's interior was dim and cool after the bright sunlight. Mira blinked, letting her eyes adjust. A single cell occupied the back wall, and within it sat a young woman with straight black hair and proud bearing. Sani's sharp eyes fixed on Mira immediately. Something flickered in their depths. Understanding, perhaps recognition of a fellow soul in trouble. She rose gracefully and approached the bars. "The washing woman sent you?" Sani's English was perfect, her tone careful. Mira stepped closer, keeping her voice low. "Your brother waits in the cottonwoods." Relief softened Sani's features for just a moment before her expression turned urgent. "Listen carefully. There's a deed, an old Spanish land grant. It proves the spring belongs to our family." She glanced toward the door where the deputy's shadow fell. "Father Ortiz keeps it safe at the mission church. You must get it to my brother." "How will I find it?" "The mission is at the edge of town, past the blacksmith's. Father Ortiz will know you by the poncho. It was our father's." Sani's fingers gripped the iron bars. "Tell him I sent you to see the old books. He'll understand." The deputy's boots scraped against the doorstep. "Time's up!" Mira's hand shook as she passed the bundle of food through the bars. Sani caught her wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Sister," she whispered, the word heavy with meaning. "Be careful. Some in this town would kill for that deed." The deputy's hand fell heavily on Mira's shoulder, steering her toward the door. She glanced back once to see Sani watching her, straight-backed and dignified despite her imprisonment. In that moment, something shifted in Mira's heart. This wasn't just about repaying Nantan's kindness anymore. She had found a sister in this struggle, someone else who understood what it meant to have everything stolen away. The bright sunlight made her eyes water as the deputy pushed her out onto the street. Or perhaps it wasn't the sun at all that brought tears to her eyes. Mira pulled the poncho closer around her shoulders and turned toward the edge of town, where the mission's bell tower rose against the desert sky. Her bare feet carried her forward with new purpose, each step bringing her closer to the proof that could free Sani and restore justice to this small corner of the world. Mira hurried away from the jail, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. The borrowed poncho shielded her from curious stares as she made her way through San Gabriel's dusty streets. The mission's weathered bell tower rose before her like a finger pointing to heaven, its adobe walls glowing orange in the late afternoon sun. The chapel stood apart from the town's other buildings, surrounded by a small garden where herbs and vegetables grew in neat rows. Wind chimes made from tin cans tinkled softly in the breeze. As Mira approached the heavy wooden doors, her heart thundered in her chest. A bell rang softly as she pushed the door open. The interior was cool and dim, smelling of beeswax candles and old wood. Padre Ortiz knelt before the altar, his silver hair catching the light that streamed through narrow windows. He turned at the sound of her entrance, and Mira saw kindness in the wrinkles around his eyes. "Welcome, child." His voice was gentle, with just a trace of Spanish accent. He stood slowly, one hand pressed against his lower back. "You seem troubled." Mira twisted her hands in the folds of the poncho. I was sent by friends." The word felt strange on her tongue. Friends. Just yesterday she'd been alone, desperate. About the spring. Understanding dawned in the priest's eyes as he studied the poncho she wore. "Ah, you've spoken with Nantan." He gestured for her to follow him behind the altar. "Come, quickly now." They passed through a small door into a room lined with shelves. Books and papers filled every available space, their leather bindings cracked with age. Padre Ortiz moved with purpose to a particular shelf, his fingers skimming over the spines until he found what he sought. "Buck Halvers came by this morning," he said, his voice tight with concern, "making threats about that spring again. Claims he has documents proving his ownership." The priest shook his head. "False documents, of course. The man thinks money can buy truth itself." He pulled a slim leather folder from between two books. "But truth has a way of surviving, even in the desert." His weathered hands opened the folder carefully, revealing yellowed papers covered in flowing Spanish script. "This is the original deed, granted to Nantan's grandfather's grandfather by the Spanish crown. The spring has belonged to their family for generations." Mira leaned closer, though she couldn't read the elaborate handwriting. "Why doesn't the sheriff honor it?" Padre Ortiz's mouth tightened. "Sheriff Roddick sees only what Halvers pays him to see. The man's pockets are deep, and his influence runs through this town like poison in a well." He pulled a piece of oilcloth from a drawer. "Which is why this must leave here now. It's no longer safe in my keeping." With reverent care, he wrapped the ancient document in the oilcloth. "Guard it well, child. This paper is more precious than gold to those who respect the law, and more dangerous than dynamite to those who don't." Mira accepted the package with trembling hands. It felt impossibly light for something that carried such weight. She tucked it carefully beneath the poncho, close to her heart. "God go with you," Padre Ortiz murmured, making the sign of the cross. "Tell Nantan I pray for his sister's release. Justice may sleep in San Gabriel, but it isn't dead." The sun hung low on the horizon as Mira slipped out of the mission. Long shadows stretched across the street like grasping fingers. She kept to the edges of buildings, moving as quietly as her bare feet would allow. Every passing stranger made her breath catch. Every distant voice sent her heart racing. The town thinned out gradually, adobe buildings giving way to scattered corrals and storage sheds. Mira could see the creek ahead, its waters painted gold by the setting sun. The cottonwoods where Nantan waited swayed gently in the evening breeze. Each step seemed to take an eternity. The package beneath her poncho felt like it was burning against her skin, though she knew it was just her imagination. A dog barked somewhere behind her, making her jump. She forced herself not to run. Running would draw attention. Finally, she reached the shelter of the cottonwoods. Nantan materialized from the shadows like a spirit, his dark eyes questioning. Mira reached beneath the poncho and carefully withdrew the oilcloth package. "The deed," she whispered, holding it out to him. "Padre Ortiz says it proves the spring belongs to your family. But the sheriff—" She swallowed hard. "The sheriff works for Buck Halvers." Nantan took the package with the same care one might handle a newborn child. His fingers traced the edges of the oilcloth before tucking it securely inside his shirt. He looked at Mira for a long moment, then nodded once, a gesture that carried the weight of mountains in its simple acknowledgement. The sun slipped behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. In the growing darkness, Mira felt the first real stirring of hope since she'd lost her own family. Here, wrapped in a borrowed poncho and standing beside a man she'd feared just yesterday, she had taken the first step toward justice. The stars emerged one by one as darkness settled over the creek bed. Mira sat cross-legged near the small fire Nantan had built, its flames carefully shielded by a ring of stones. The warmth seeped into her tired bones, and the smell of wood smoke mingled with the desert sage. Nantan approached from where he'd been tending his horse, carrying something wrapped in a cloth. He settled beside her and unwrapped a bundle of dried meat, hard biscuits, and a handful of dried berries. With deliberate movements, he divided the food into 2 equal portions. "Thank you," Mira whispered, accepting her share. The simple gesture of sharing brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, focusing on the food before her. Nantan inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement that carried more weight than words. After they'd eaten in comfortable silence, he pulled the deed from inside his shirt, studying it in the firelight. "Tomorrow," he said, his deep voice barely above a whisper, "you show sheriff." His English was halting but clear. "People watch. Cannot ignore." Mira nodded, understanding his strategy. "In public, where everyone can see." She picked up a stick and drew in the dirt, mapping out the town square. "If we do it when the morning crowd is there, he'll have to respond properly." A coyote's haunting call echoed across the desert, answered by another in the distance. The sound made Mira shiver, though not entirely from fear. There was something wild and free in that cry, something that spoke to her own desperate need for justice. Nantan added another small branch to the fire, careful to keep the flames low. The orange light played across his features, highlighting the quiet strength in his expression. He touched the spot on the crude map where Mira had marked the spring. "Sonny born there," he said softly. His eyes grew distant with memory. Summer night. Stars bright like now. His hand moved in a gentle arc, indicating the glittering sky above them. Mothers say Sani's first cry makes spring flow stronger. Mira leaned forward, drawn in by this glimpse into their family history. Your mother, is she? Gone. Nantan's voice held old pain. 2 winters passed. Made us promise. Protect the spring. Sacred trust. The words struck a chord in Mira's heart. She thought of her own family, of promises left unfulfilled. I understand about promises, she said quietly, about protecting what matters. Nantan turned to look at her fully, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. For the first time, Mira saw him truly see her, not as a desperate girl by the creek, not as a useful ally, but as someone who shared his understanding of loss and duty. Your family? He asked simply. Mira stared into the flames. Land grabbers, she said, the words bitter on her tongue. Like Halvers. They wanted our farm. When Pa wouldn't sell, she couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. Nantan's slight nod showed he understood. Another coyote called, closer now. Nantan reached for his rifle, checking it with practiced hands before laying it across his lap. The gesture wasn't nervous, just careful like everything else about him. Sleep, he said, nodding toward the bedroll he'd laid out earlier. Tomorrow needs strength. Mira should have felt afraid, sleeping in the open with a man she barely knew. Instead, she felt an unexpected sense of security. This wasn't the blind trust of desperation that had driven her to grab his coat by the creek. This was something she chose, a trust built on shared purpose and understanding. As she settled onto the bedroll, pulling the borrowed blanket around her shoulders, she watched Nantan's silhouette against the star-filled sky. He sat straight and alert, a guardian figure keeping watch over their small camp. The deed lay safe against his chest, and his sister waited in a jail cell in town. But tomorrow they would take the first step toward making things right. The coyotes sang their wild chorus across the desert, and Mira felt something shift inside her heart. She was no longer just helping Nantan because she needed food and shelter. She was committed to their cause because it was right, because some things, family, land, promises, were worth fighting for. She closed her eyes, listening to the pop and crackle of the small fire, the soft nickering of Nantan's horse, and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. For the first time since losing her family, she felt the stirrings of belonging, not to a place but to a purpose, to a promise, to justice. The night wrapped around them like a protective blanket, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, in this moment, 2 unlikely allies had found common ground under the vast Arizona sky. The first rays of sunlight painted the adobe buildings in shades of gold as Mira walked purposefully down San Gabriel's main street. Her borrowed poncho fluttered in the morning breeze, the precious deed tucked securely against her chest. A few early risers paused their morning routines to watch her pass, curiosity evident in their sideways glances. The sheriff's office stood squat and imposing at the end of the street, its weathered wooden sign creaking softly. Mira's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her chin high and her steps steady. The memory of Nantan's quiet strength and Sani's fierce dignity in her jail cell gave her courage. Sheriff Roddick sat behind his desk, boots propped up on the scarred wood, picking at his yellowed teeth with a wooden splinter. The office smelled of stale tobacco and unwashed bodies. He barely glanced up as Mira entered, treating her with the same dismissive air he showed to all who weren't wealthy or powerful. "What do you want, girl?" he drawled, not bothering to lower his boots. Mira pulled the deed from beneath her poncho and slapped it down on his desk. The sharp sound made him start. "I have proof that the spring belongs to the Apache family you've imprisoned Sani over." Roddick's boots hit the floor with a thud. He leaned forward, beady eyes narrowing as he studied her face. "Now wait just a minute." "No, you wait." Mira's voice rose, carrying through the open door to the street outside. "This is a legal Spanish land grant, witnessed and sealed. You've got an innocent woman in your jail based on lies?" The sheriff's face reddened as he noticed several townspeople slowing their pace outside, trying to listen in. He stood up, attempting to tower over Mira, but she didn't back down. "Lower your voice, Missy," he hissed. "You don't know what you're meddling in." "I know exactly what I'm meddling in," Mira shot back even louder. "Theft, corruption, false imprisonment." Each word rang out like a gunshot. A small crowd had gathered near the doorway now. Roddick's eyes darted between them and Mira, his face growing increasingly uncomfortable. He reached for the deed with sweaty fingers, but Mira snatched it back. "This needs to be verified properly," she declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "In public, with witnesses." Roddick's jaw worked as he considered his options. The growing audience had him cornered, and he knew it. "Fine," he spat finally. "Sunday Mass. We'll have Father Ortiz examine it proper-like." His attempt at a reasonable tone fooled no one. "Until then, the prisoner stays where she is." "The whole town will be watching," Mira reminded him pointedly. She turned toward the door, her heart racing with a mixture of triumph and terror. That's when she saw him. Buck Halvers filled the doorway, his expensive boots and crisp shirt a stark contrast to the dusty townspeople behind him. His eyes locked onto Mira's face, and she saw the moment recognition flickered in them. The same cold, calculating look he'd worn that night at her family's farm, when everything had gone up in flames. The air seemed to freeze between them. Halvers's hand twitched near his gun belt, but he wouldn't dare draw with so many witnesses. His forced smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, well," he said softly, just loud enough for Mira to hear as she passed. "Looks like we've got some unfinished business, little girl." Mira kept walking, her legs trembling but her steps steady. She could feel Halvers's stare burning into her back as she pushed through the gathered crowd. They parted for her, murmuring amongst themselves, the story already spreading through the town like wildfire. She'd done it. She'd forced their hand, made them agree to a public examination of the deed. But the cost had been exposure. Halvers knew who she was now, and she'd just made herself his enemy. The same man who'd destroyed her family now had a new reason to come after her. The morning sun felt cold on her face as she strode back toward the outskirts of town, where Nantan waited. Each step took her further from the sheriff's office, but she could still feel the weight of what had just happened settling around her shoulders. She'd declared war on the most powerful men in San Gabriel, armed with nothing but a piece of paper and her own determination. The deed felt heavy against her chest, carrying the weight of promises, justice, and now, vengeance. She'd known this path would be dangerous when she'd agreed to help Nantan and Sani. Now, with Halvers in the mix, the stakes had risen even higher, but there was no turning back. She'd chosen her side, and she would see it through, whatever the cost. Mira hurried back to the cottonwoods where Nantan waited, her legs still shaky from the confrontation. She found him crouched by a small fire, brewing strong-smelling herbs in a tin cup. His dark eyes studied her face as she approached, reading the tension in her features. "They agreed," she said, catching her breath. "The sheriff will have Father Ortiz examine the deed during Sunday Mass." She settled onto a sun-warmed rock, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "But we have another problem. Buck Halvers saw me. He knows who I am now." Nantan nodded slowly, processing this information. He poured some of the herbal tea into a battered tin cup and handed it to her. The warm liquid smelled of sage and something sweeter she couldn't name. "We stay close," he said after a long moment, "near Mission. Father knows place." He gathered their few belongings and led Mira through a winding path behind the Mission. An old line shack stood nestled against a rocky outcrop, its weathered boards still solid despite years of neglect. Inside, dust motes danced in the sunbeams that filtered through the cracks, but the roof was sound and the stone fireplace intact. "Father Ortiz lets travelers stay here sometimes," Nantan explained, his words careful and measured. "Safe for now." They spent the afternoon making the shack habitable, sweeping out dust and checking for unwanted dessert creatures. Nantan disappeared briefly, returning with fresh water and some dried meat from his saddlebags. As the sun began its descent, Father Ortiz appeared at the door, his kind face creased with concern and purpose. "I've arranged something," he said softly. "The deputy owes me a favor. Sani will come here tonight under the pretense of confession." His eyes twinkled. After all, every soul has the right to seek guidance, even those behind bars. True to his word, as evening painted the sky in deep purples and blues, Father Ortiz returned with Sani. The deputy stood guard outside, more interested in his tobacco than his charge. Sani entered the shack with quiet dignity, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she embraced her brother. Mira watched their reunion from the corner, feeling both part of and separate from this intimate moment. But then Sani turned to her, reaching out to grasp her hands. "Thank you," Sani said in perfect English, her voice rich and clear. "Nantan told me what you risked today." She squeezed Mira's hands. "You didn't have to help us." "Yes, I did," Mira replied softly. They shared a simple meal of corn cakes and dried meat, sitting cross-legged on the plank floor. Father Ortiz had brought fresh tortillas wrapped in a clean cloth, still warm from the mission kitchen. As they ate, Sani began to speak, first in Spanish to Father Ortiz, then in English for Mira's benefit. "Our great-grandmother received this grant from the Spanish crown," she said, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that spoke of often-told stories. She was a healer, respected by both her people and the Spanish. The spring was sacred to us long before any papers existed, but she understood the importance of their laws. Sani recited the history of the land grant with the precision of one who had memorized every detail, every name, every boundary marker. Her words painted pictures of generations who had lived by the spring, of ceremonies performed, of children born and elders laid to rest. Mira found herself leaning forward, caught in the spell of Sani's voice, understanding now why this piece of land meant so much more than just water rights. As night settled fully around the shack, Nantan sat in the doorway, his knife moving in steady strokes across a whetstone. The soft, rhythmic sound underscored Sani's words like a heartbeat. Mira watched his hands, steady and sure, not preparing for battle but maintaining his tools with the same care he showed everything in his life. The single lantern cast warm shadows on the walls, and Mira felt something shift inside her chest. Here, in this humble shack, she recognized what was growing between them. It wasn't just alliance or convenience that bound them together. It was something more fragile and precious, a family forming out of shared purpose and trust. Father Ortiz caught her eye and smiled gently, as if reading her thoughts. He had seen many families in his years of service, some bound by blood, others by choice. The ones forged in adversity, he knew, often proved the strongest. When it came time for Sani to return to her cell, they all stood close together for a moment, reluctant to break the sacred circle of their evening. Sani hugged her brother again, then surprised Mira with an embrace just as fierce. The deputy's impatient cough from outside broke the moment, and Sani straightened her shoulders, resuming her dignified bearing as she followed Father Ortiz into the night. Mira and Nantan stood in the doorway until their footsteps faded. The desert night wrapped around them like a blanket, filled with the soft calling of night birds and the distant song of coyotes. Neither spoke, but their silence held all the weight of the family they were becoming, as fragile and precious as the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. The Sunday morning sky hung low and heavy, thick clouds pressing down on San Gabriel like a wool blanket. Mira stood before the small mirror in the line shack, trying to smooth her wrinkled dress, the best she could manage from the mission's charity box. Nantan had already left to watch from the shadows, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts. The mission bells tolled, their deep bronze voices calling the faithful to Mass. Mira's hands trembled as she clutched the oilskin-wrapped deed. She took a deep breath, remembering Sani's quiet strength, and stepped out into the gray morning. Townsfolk streamed toward the whitewashed church, their Sunday best dulled by the overcast sky. They clustered in small groups. whispers following Mira as she passed. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion, but most carried the cautious look of people unwilling to choose sides. Inside the church, the air hung thick with incense and tension. Father Ortiz stood at the altar, his weathered face serene despite the unusual circumstances. Sani sat in the front pew, her hands bound, but her head held high. 2 deputies flanked her, looking uncomfortable in the sacred space. Buck Halvers lounged near the back, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the simple dress of most parishioners. His mouth wore its usual smirk, but his eyes betrayed worry as he watched more and more people file in. Mira slipped into the seat beside Father Ortiz, carefully placing the deed on the wooden lectern. The priest's gentle hand squeezed her shoulder, steadying her nerves. Sheriff Roddick stood by the door, his badge gleaming dully in the candlelight, his expression carefully neutral. When the last stragglers settled into their seats, Father Ortiz raised his hands for silence. "Brothers and sisters," his voice carried clearly through the hushed church, "we gather today not just for worship, but for justice. Before us lies a document that speaks to the true ownership of the spring that has caused such strife in our community." He carefully unfolded the deed, the yellowed paper crinkling softly. This land grant, dated 1832, was bestowed by the Spanish crown upon the family of White Dove, a respected Apache healer, and her descendants. His clear voice read through the formal language, the precise boundaries, the official seals. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Mira watched faces change as understanding dawned. This wasn't some vague claim, but a legal document older than many of their own land titles. "That paper ain't worth the ink it's printed with," Halvers's voice boomed from the back. Those savages kept better records than you, Mr. Halvers." Sani's voice cut through his protest, clear and educated, shocking many who had never heard her speak. "Our family has tended that spring for 4 generations. Every boundary marker mentioned in that deed still stands." More whispers, these tinged with sympathy. Mira saw women nudging their husbands, saw weathered ranchers frowning thoughtfully. The tide of opinion was shifting, slowly but surely. That's when something snapped inside Mira. She stood, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I know what it means to have land stolen." Her voice shook at first, then steadied. "Buck Halvers's men burned my family's homestead last winter. My parents died in that fire, all because we dared to dispute his water rights." The church fell silent. Even Halvers's smirk faltered as every eye turned to Mira. "I was there when they came. I saw their faces by the light of our burning barn. I heard them laugh." Her words rang in the stillness. "They thought they'd killed us all, but I survived. And now I'm watching the same man try to steal from another family, using the same lies, the same threats." An old woman in the third pew crossed herself. A young mother pulled her children closer. The air in the church grew thick with shared outrage. Sheriff Roddick shifted uncomfortably, aware of the changing mood. He cleared his throat. "Given the nature of this document and the serious allegations presented, I reckon this deed deserves proper consideration." He tugged at his collar. "We'll need to verify it through proper channels, of course." "And Sani remains in custody until then?" Father Ortiz asked quietly. The sheriff hesitated, feeling the weight of public opinion. "She'll be moved to house arrest, under the mission's supervision, pending investigation." It wasn't perfect justice, but Mira saw hope bloom in Sani's eyes. The deputies moved to remove her shackles, no longer treating her as a common criminal. Throughout the church, people were standing, gathering in clusters, their voices rising with questions and comments. Buck Halvers stormed out, his boot heels angry on the wooden floor. But Mira noticed how few people acknowledged his departure. The power of his influence seemed to diminish with each step he took. Father Ortiz carefully refolded the deed, his aged hands gentle with the precious document. The morning light was finally breaking through the clouds. sending rays of sunlight through the high windows to paint the church floor in patterns of gold and shadow. For the first time since arriving in San Gabriel, Mira felt the weight of truth tipping the scales of justice. The line shack felt almost cozy in the fading light. Sani, released into Father Ortiz's custody, sat cross-legged on a worn blanket while Nantan stirred a pot of beans over the small fire. Mira leaned against the rough-hewn wall, watching the siblings share quiet smiles. Their victory at the church, though incomplete, had kindled a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt since before the raid on her family's home. "The townspeople's faces," Sani said softly, accepting a tin cup of coffee from her brother. "I never thought they'd listen. Never thought they'd see us as anything but—" She stopped, shaking her head. "They saw the truth today," Mira replied, wrapping her arms around her knees. Even Sheriff Roddick couldn't ignore it. Nantan nodded, his usual silence carrying a hint of satisfaction. The wooden spoon scraped against the pot as he served their simple meal. Outside, crickets chirped in the gathering dusk, and a cool breeze carried the sweet scent of desert sage through the cracks in the walls. Mira had just raised her spoon when Sani suddenly stiffened. "Do you smell that?" A new scent cut through the sage, sharp, acrid, wrong. Nantan was on his feet in an instant, moving to the door. When he pulled it open, their peaceful evening shattered. Orange flames lit the horizon like a second sunset, reaching hungry fingers toward the darkening sky. Black smoke billowed upward, and even from this distance they could hear the crackle and roar. "The mission!" Sani leaped up, her dinner clattering to the floor. "Father Ortiz! The deed!" She lunged toward the door, but Nantan caught her arm, his grip gentle but immovable. His face was carved from stone as he held his struggling sister. "Let me go!" Sani's voice cracked with desperation. "We have to help!" "No!" Nantan's single word carried the weight of painful wisdom. "Trap!" Mira's heart plunged into her stomach as understanding dawned. "Halvers," she whispered. "This is his answer to this morning." The flames reflected in Sani's tears as she stopped struggling, her brother's arms now supporting rather than restraining her. The three stood in the doorway, watching helplessly as the mission burned. A sound behind them, a boot on wooden planks, came too late. "Ain't you a clever girl?" a rough voice drawled. Mira spun to find three of Halvers's men, filling the small space, revolvers drawn. How had they crept up so quietly? "Boss says the lady needs to return to more secure accommodations." Nantan moved with lightning speed, shoving both women behind him, but another gun pressed against the back of his head through the open door. They were surrounded. "Don't try it, Chief," the man holding the gun sneered. "Boss wants her alive, but he didn't say nothing about you two." Sani stood tall, her chin lifted. "I'll go," she said quietly. "No blood tonight." "Sani, no!" Mira reached for her friend, but Sani caught her hand, squeezing it once before letting go. "This isn't over, sister," Sani whispered. Then she walked forward, allowing one of the men to bind her hands. Mira watched, helpless, as they dragged Sani into the night. Nantan remained perfectly still until the sound of hoofbeats faded, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Only then did he move to the door, staring at the still-burning mission. The fire painted the desert in shades of hell. Mira sank to her knees, the weight of failure crushing her chest. The deed, their proof, their hope, would be ashes by morning. She'd underestimated Halvers, thought public opinion would protect them. Instead, her challenge had brought destruction to those who'd helped them and torn their newfound family apart. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice raw. "This is my fault. I thought we'd won." Nantan turned from the door, his expression unreadable in the fire-cast shadows. He crossed to where she knelt and placed a hand on her shoulder. The gesture held no blame, only shared grief and determination. The mission's bell tower collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a fountain of sparks into the night sky. In the distance they could hear shouts as the townspeople fought a losing battle against the flames. The deed that proved Sani's claim, that could have brought justice was surely nothing but ash now. Mira stared into the fire that had stolen their victory, her hands curling into fists. She'd lost one family to flames. Now Halvers had used fire once again to destroy her hopes of finding another. The familiar taste of ashes filled her mouth, but this time it brought not just grief but rage. In the red-lit darkness, the mission continued to burn, its destruction a beacon of Halvers' ruthlessness and a testament to how much they had underestimated his capacity for evil. Dawn painted the mission ruins in shades of gray and black. Smoke still curled from the charred timbers, and the acrid scent of burned wood hung heavy in the morning air. Mira picked her way through the debris, her boots crunching on broken glass and scorched adobe. The bell tower, though damaged, still stood like a blackened sentinel against the pale sky. Father Ortiz sat on an overturned bucket beneath the tower's shadow, his weathered face streaked with soot. His usually pristine collar was gray with ash, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched his leather-bound Bible. Nantan appeared silently beside them, his keen eyes scanning the ruins for any sign of danger. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Father Ortiz said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. He opened his Bible with careful fingers, revealing a folded paper tucked between its pages. "I always keep copies of important documents with his word." Mira's heart leapt as he withdrew the paper. The edges were singed, and smoke had yellowed the corners, but the Spanish text remained clear and legible. "A copy of the deed," she breathed. "Not complete," Father Ortiz admitted, smoothing the paper with gentle hands, "but enough to prove the spring's rightful ownership. The dates, the signatures, they're all here." Mira sank down onto a fallen beam, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. She hadn't slept since Sani's capture, and her body ached from tension. Still, her mind raced. "We have to move quickly," she said, forcing herself to focus. "Halvers will try to push through his claim now that he thinks the original deed is destroyed." Nantan's hand moved to the knife at his belt, his knuckles white with restraint. Mira saw the battle in his eyes, the warrior's instinct to meet violence with violence warring with his deeper principles. "No, my friend," Father Ortiz said softly, reading Nantan's gesture. "Blood will only breed more blood. We must find another way." Nantan's hand slowly relaxed, though his jaw remained tight. He nodded once, recommitting to his vow of peaceful resolution. Father Ortiz leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There are those in town who remember the old ways, the old families. Doña Maria Velasco, Widow Thornton, the Rodriguez sisters, they all have connections to the original Spanish land grants." "The widows?" Mira said, understanding dawning. "They've lived here longer than anyone. Their families would have known about the Apache claims." "And they hold more sway than Halvers knows," Father Ortiz added. "Their words carry weight with the older families, the ones who remember when this land knew justice." Nantan moved closer, his shadow falling across the singed deed copy. His expression remained stoic, but Mira had learned to read the subtle shifts in his demeanor. He approved of this path. "We'll need to gather them secretly," Mira said, her mind already forming plans. "Halvers has eyes everywhere." "The old chapel," Father Ortiz suggested, "behind the tannery. No one uses it anymore, but the walls still stand. The widows know it well. Many of their husbands' funerals were held there." Mira stood, swaying slightly with fatigue but determined. "I can reach them through their servants. Most work in the market early morning." "I will pray with them first," Father Ortiz said, carefully returning the deed copy to his Bible. "Prayer loosens tongues and opens hearts. Then we will show them the proof." Nantan touched the scorched bell tower, his fingers tracing the blackened stone. His gesture spoke volumes. The destruction of the mission had shaken the town's conscience. The time was right to appeal to their sense of justice. "We'll need all of them," Mira said. "Every widow, every old family member who remembers the truth. Halvers can intimidate a few, but he can't silence the whole town's history." Father Ortiz rose, clutching his Bible close. Despite his exhaustion, his eyes shone with purpose. "The truth may be wounded, my children, but it cannot be burned away. God's justice works through community, through the bonds between people." Mira looked at her unlikely allies, the Apache warrior who chose peace over vengeance, the elderly priest whose faith never wavered, and felt strength flow back into her tired limbs. They would fight Halvers not with guns or fire, but with memory and solidarity. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the mission's broken walls. In the distance, the town was coming awake, unaware that the seeds of resistance were being planted in the ashes of Halvers's destruction. "Tonight," Mira said firmly. "We'll gather them tonight." Nantan nodded, his silent approval carrying the weight of generations who had fought for their land through peaceful means. Father Ortiz blessed himself, murmuring a quiet prayer over the Bible that held their fragile hope. Among the ruins of the mission, 3 unlikely allies stood united, choosing the harder path of justice over the swift satisfaction of revenge. The bell tower rose above them, scorched but unbroken, a testament to what could survive the flames of hatred. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as Mira and Father Ortiz made their way through San Gabriel's winding streets. Their first stop was the imposing adobe mansion of Doña Estrella, its whitewashed walls gleaming like pearls against the dusty landscape. Mira's heart thundered in her chest as Father Ortiz knocked on the heavy wooden door. A servant ushered them into a cool, dim parlor, where dark wooden furniture stood like sentinels against embroidered walls. Doña Estrella sat straight-backed in a high-backed chair, her silver hair arranged perfectly beneath a black lace mantilla. Her sharp eyes took in Mira's worn clothing and determined stance. "Padre Ortiz," she said, her voice carrying the weight of generations. "What brings you to my home with this?" She paused, studying Mira. "Young stranger?" Father Ortiz bowed slightly. "Doña, we come seeking your wisdom and influence in a matter of grave injustice." Mira stepped forward, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Ma'am, I know about the old Spanish land grants, about how your family helped maintain peace with the Apache people through honored agreements." Interest flickered in Doña Estrella's dark eyes. "You speak of ancient history, child." "No, ma'am, I speak of today." Mira's hands trembled as she described Sani's imprisonment, the burning of the mission, and Halvers's attempts to steal the spring. The deed still exists, but without the support of respected families like yours, the truth will be buried. Doña Estrella's fingers tightened on her chair's armrest. "Buck Halvers," she said, the name bitter on her tongue. "That man has no respect for tradition or honor." Father Ortiz produced his Bible, showing her the singed deed copy. "The original agreements were witnessed by your grandfather, Doña." The older woman leaned forward, her eyes scanning the familiar signature. Something shifted in her expression, pride mingled with responsibility. "And now this Apache girl, this Sani, rots in jail for defending her birthright?" "Yes, ma'am," Mira said softly. "While Halvers burns our evidence and threatens anyone who stands against him." Doña Estrella rose suddenly, her black skirts rustling like thunder. "My grandfather's name stands on that paper. Our family's honor is bound to those promises." She paced to a window, gazing out at the town her ancestors had helped build. "What would you have me do?" "Stand with us," Mira pleaded. "Rally the other widows. Show the sheriff that the town's most respected families remember the truth." The matriarch turned, her eyes blazing with renewed purpose. "Widow Thornton still hosts her morning coffee circle. The Rodriguez sisters never miss it." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Perhaps it's time I paid them a visit." Throughout the day, they visited other influential women. In parlors and garden patios, over cups of tea and coffee, Mira told her story again and again. Father Ortiz's presence lent them credibility, but it was Mira's passionate truth that moved hearts. One by one, The widows agreed. They would gather at the sheriff's office the next morning. As sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Mira and Father Ortiz made their final call. Doña Estrella had gathered 12 women in her parlor, their faces grave but determined. "Tomorrow at 9 o'clock, Doña Estrella announced, her voice ringing with authority. "We will remind Sheriff Roddick that this town's memory runs deeper than Buck Halvers's pockets." The women nodded, their collective resolve filling the room like a physical presence. These were not just grieving widows. They were the guardians of San Gabriel's conscience, and they had chosen their side. Later that night, Mira sat beside Nantan outside the line shack, watching stars pierce the velvet sky. The day's events had left her drained but hopeful. She told him about each visit, each small victory in winning the widow's support. Nantan listened in his characteristic silence, but his shoulders had relaxed slightly. When Mira described Doña Estrella's fierce commitment to honoring her grandfather's signature, he nodded with deep appreciation. "Your sister would be proud," Mira said softly. "We're fighting for her the way she fought for the spring, with truth instead of violence." Nantan's eyes reflected the starlight as he gazed toward town, toward where Sani waited in her cell. His large hands were still on his knees, patient yet ready. Though the weight of worry still pressed down on them both, something else had taken root, a cautious hope, nourished by the promise of tomorrow's stand. The night air carried the distant yip of coyotes and the rustle of wind through scrub brush. Mira pulled her knees to her chest, feeling the familiar ache of missing her own family. But here, sitting in comfortable silence with Nantan, watching the stars wheel overhead, she felt the stirrings of belonging. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight, in this moment of quiet anticipation, she allowed herself to believe in justice. Dawn painted San Gabriel's main street in shades of amber, and rose as townswomen gathered before the sheriff's office. Their black mourning dresses stood stark against the dusty ground, a wall of dignified resistance. Doña Estrella took her place at the front, spine straight as a cavalry sword, her silver-streaked hair gleaming beneath her mantilla. Sheriff Roddick emerged from his office, coffee cup in hand, and froze at the sight of San Gabriel's most prominent widows assembled on his doorstep. Buck Halvers arrived moments later, his usual swagger faltering as he noted the growing crowd. "What's the meaning of this?" Roddick demanded, his voice carrying less authority than usual. Doña Estrella stepped forward, her voice clear and commanding. "We are here to witness justice, Sheriff, the kind our fathers and grandfathers upheld before you." Mira slipped through the crowd, the partial deed clutched carefully in her hands. Though her heart raced, she kept her voice steady. "The proof survived your fire, Mr. Halvers." The rancher's face darkened. "Now see here." "Bring out the prisoner," Doña Estrella interrupted, fixing the sheriff with an unflinching stare. "Let her hear her family's truth spoken aloud." Two deputies emerged with Sani between them, her wrists still bound. Despite her chains, she held her head high, meeting the gathered women's eyes with quiet dignity. Mira unfolded the scorched document with trembling fingers. "This deed, witnessed by Doña Estrella's grandfather, proves the spring belongs to Sani's people. It was never yours to take, Mr. Halvers." Widow Thornton stepped forward, her voice quavering but firm. "My husband served as town clerk for 30 years. I remember these agreements. The Apache people honored their part. As did the Spanish families," added Elena Rodriguez, her sister Maria nodding beside her. "We do not forget our obligations." Sheriff Roddick shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading on his forehead despite the early hour. The weight of respectability pressed against him from all sides. Widows whose husbands had built San Gabriel, whose words carried generations of authority. "The deed appears legitimate," he admitted grudgingly, examining the document, "and with so many reliable witnesses to its history." Halvers started to protest, but the cold stares of a dozen matriarchs silenced him. his face flushed red with humiliation as he realized his defeat. "Release her!" Roddick ordered the deputies, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The chains fell away from Sani's wrists. She rubbed them briefly, then walked with measured steps to stand beside Mira and Doña Estrella. The crowd parted as Halvers pushed through, his boots kicking up dust as he retreated down the street. The morning sun now stood full above the adobe buildings, its light touching the faces of women who had chosen truth over power, dignity over force. Their victory hung in the air like a prayer answered, wrapped in the silence of justice restored. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the spring as Mira, Nantan, and Sani made their way along the familiar trail. The water bubbled up from the earth clear and sweet, just as it had for generations of Nantan's people. Sani knelt beside it, touching the surface with reverent fingers. "Our mother used to sing here," she said softly, her voice carrying on the gentle breeze. "Now we can hear those songs again." Together they began clearing away the debris that had accumulated during the months of neglect. Mira's hands worked steadily alongside theirs, pulling weeds and moving stones. The work felt different now, not a desperate act of survival, but the beginning of something new. Nantan paused in his labor, turning to Mira with quiet certainty in his eyes. "This is your home too," he said, his words careful but clear. "If you wish it." Mira's hand stilled on a fallen branch. Her throat tightened as she looked between brother and sister, seeing not pity but genuine acceptance in their faces. Sani reached out and squeezed her hand. "We protect our own," Sani said simply. "You fought for our spring. Now you're family." They worked until the sun began to sink, marking out spaces where walls would rise, where a garden might grow. As dusk approached, they settled beside the spring for a simple meal of corn cakes and dried meat. The water caught the last rays of sunlight, sparkling like scattered gold. Mira watched the ripples dance across the surface, feeling the deep quiet in her chest that she hadn't known since before her family's death. Here, beside this ancient spring with her chosen family, she had found more than justice. She had found peace. The morning dew sparkled on the freshly tilled earth of their garden. 4 days of steady work had transformed the space around the spring. The line shack now stood sturdy and clean, its weathered walls patched with new planks and fresh mud daubing. Neat rows of turned soil waited for seeds, promising future harvests. Mira led Nantan's massive warhorse from where he grazed, her movements confident and sure. The leather of the saddle creaked as she adjusted the cinch, remembering how terrified she'd been of this same horse just weeks ago. Now her hands moved with practiced ease over the familiar tack. Nantan emerged from the line shack watching her work. When she finished, he stepped forward and gestured toward the saddle with an open palm, the same gesture he'd made on that first desperate evening. But this time, his eyes held warmth rather than careful assessment. This wasn't a command born of necessity, but an invitation freely given. Mira gathered the reins and mounted smoothly, settling into the saddle as naturally as breathing. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in strokes of pink and gold, casting long shadows across the spring-fed meadow. She sat tall, her shoulders straight, no longer the frightened girl who had collapsed at a stranger's feet, begging for mercy. In her place sat a young woman who had found her voice, her courage, and most precious of all, her family. The town of San Gabriel lay quiet in the distance as they rode together across the awakening land. Mira breathed in the crisp morning air, feeling the strong horse beneath her, and the presence of her newfound brother beside her. Her heart was full with the certainty of belonging, of having fought for what was right, and found her true home in the process. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.